The media is a huge reflection of the world that we live in. And so this morning we're talking to 4 fantastic detectives of what's happening in today's news. And so I'm just going to, and before I do that, I've got on my right-hand side, Priscilla, no, Pascal, Kyra, sorry, it was Pascal last night, sorry, Kyra, who's going to sign. And then on my left-hand side, we've got Sarah Anderson. She was part of the very successful No More Page 3 campaign. Thank you. She's an HR professional who produces pro bono advice to women's charities and organisations. She's also written for the Feminist Times, HuffPost, and her own blog, etc. I hope you do get paid for some of the things you do.
The day job I get paid for.
Okay, your day job, which is?
And HR, yeah.
In HR, okay. But an example of somebody who just thought, right, I'm going to try and change something and do something, and then made it happen. Amazing. Brenda Emmanus, currently BBC London Arts and Culture and Entertainment correspondent, with her own fan club, quite rightly. She's been broadcasting for many, many years, and you'll often hear on The Early Show and Woman's Hour. She wrote for The Voice newspaper. She has several short stories published as well.
Many years ago, yeah.
Many years ago. Are you going to go back to that?
If I had the time, motherhood, work, struggling, but it's something I'd love to because I enjoyed it and it was a challenge, so I'll find time.
We'll take that as a yes then.
All right, yeah, that's a yes.
That's a yes. On my right, Jon Snow. I think we all know Jon for championing many causes, a human rights activist on lots of fronts, and has travelled the world to cover some of those amazing moments of justice being recovered, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the release of Nelson Mandela, Barack Obama's inauguration, and then recently, and devastatingly, the earthquake in Haiti. He's had many awards: Richard Dimbleby BAFTA Award for Best Factual Contribution, Royal Society Television Awards, Journalist of the Year, Presenter of the Year, etc. And he's also been very critical in the festival which we launched last year, Being a Man. And then on my right, finally, Robyn Archer, singer, writer, yes, public arts advocate. She's somebody who, I've always thought of her as the example of the Renaissance woman, because she is fundamentally a fantastic artist and artistic practitioner who then works out whose voices are not included in artistic conversations. And in that context, she has really made Australia constantly reconfigure the conversations with different groups around different festivals that she's made. She's the Officer of the Order of Australia. She's the Chevalier de l'Ordre des Arts de Lettres in France. She's the Officer of the Crown in Belgium. She has endless honorary degrees and fellowships. I think that's fair to say, isn't it? She has an amazing sense of humour. That's probably the most important thing to say. And she's the person who's going to be doing the cultural festival for the Commonwealth Games in 2018 in Australia, where she's invited WOW to be doing the WOW Commonwealth. So let's just start by talking about the kind of the tone of the papers as you felt they existed. I mean, we were reading this morning and thinking, okay, turning the sound up. Can you not hear me? Oh, okay. I'm the best. Did you hear that, folks? I'm the best. Okay,
we'll speak louder.
We'll speak louder, we'll project louder, and we'll nearer the microphones. Yeah.
But okay, we agree Jude's the best, huh?
We can rock with that.
Thank you. Yes, so the tone of the papers generally, I mean, what was your sense about looking across all of them, broadsheets and tabloids? What did you feel?
There was a great deal of stories about Women's Day, and there was focus on International Women's Day, which was lovely to see. Obviously, wearing my No More Page 3 hat, I did have a look in the Sun. I thought, I'm going to be very balanced, and I'm going to pick out a very positive story about women from the Sun. You won't see one of those covered here today. So, I think there's still an awful lot of work to do. And another thing we saw was where there would be a positive story, it would immediately be undercut by something either negative about women or the sort of traditional female stereotypes being presented by the papers. So on the one hand, there was sort of lots of really lovely, interesting, positive stuff, some of which we're going to cover today. And then on the other hand, there was still that, these are the roles that women play. And if they don't play those roles, we're going to criticise them.
Brenda, what was your sense?
Yeah, I mirror that. I think there was a real sense of it's International Women's Day and month, so we must try hard, and all the male editors go, find me stories that are relevant, let's put them out there, let's tell a headline. And there was a lot of effort made. There was, as you said, a lot of contradiction as well. There was also, I think, maybe because we're sensitive and we're looking for it, some frightening images, not just the words that were said. There's some really sexist, frightening, terrifying, particularly in the fashion areas. We noticed that there seemed to be some that were quite disturbing. But there has been a concerted effort. There is a lot to debate today in the papers. There's a lot to discuss. And there is a lot of controversy. And I guess we can only see that as a positive thing, because you've got to start somewhere.
I think this is one of the frightening images, if you can see it. Can you see that yet? No?
Doesn't it have to be the other way out? No,
it just has to show it. Well, while we're waiting for it to show, John, what was we all talked about schizophrenia actually in the papers, didn't we? These, on the one hand there was lots of news, and then suddenly there was no news in different sections.
I thought collectively, whatever sex you were, they were rather boring. But sadly, the papers with the lower circulation had the best coverage for women.
Right, that's a really important point. And you thought that was the Independent, didn't you?
The Indy was very...
Independent was excellent, I thought. Excellent, and the Observer pretty good.
Robyn?
Yeah, I think they varied enormously from nothing in the Telegraph to everything in the Independent to rather confused coverage in the Times, which has already been said would have one apparently good story but needed to counteract that with a bad one. The Independent, I think, is particularly good. Every page you go, and rather unannounced, there's a photograph on the front that's not announced as International Women's Day, but has the photographs of many women who are covered in this, and then on the editorial page, on the inside, the power for women across the world, which is very, very good. And in the editorial saying, we hope that this edition shows to you, and it's only right through to the editorial, we hope this edition shows you that there can be really positive stories about women. So full score to the Independent. The confusion of the Sunday Times was best exemplified for me in a picture on the front cover, which this morning on television, the BBC correspondent said, there's a great picture on the front cover. And it's Sarah Brightman in a space outfit being trained in Russia to go up to space. And John, I understand that you're a chorister as well. You're a singer as well, and for me...
True, but I don't have 35 million, which is what she has paid to go up.
That's the worst fact is that she's paid £35 million for this trip into space, and in the last 2 days, all I've heard is how much funding is needed to make the position for women better across the world. £35 million pounds to go up to space is wild, but this picture visually is challenging because it's a singer who's boxed up and with a helmet and tied up and secured. And it's part of the confusion, I think, that the Sunday Times represents today.
OK, very good. Now, we may or may not, our technicians are absolutely fantastic, but we might have a little glitch for a while, so bear with that. But one of the stories that I think, was excited me, it says, poverty is sexist, leading women sign up for global equality. This is in the Observer. And it's an open letter from many, many women, including me, I should add. But the reason I'm talking about it is it refers to the fact that tonight Christine Lagarde here in London Southbank Centre today, the head of the International Monetary Fund, Christine Lagarde, will be adding her voice to making the economic case for gender equality. And the whole tenor of this article is that the campaign that will be launched this evening is that the Millennium Goals, the new Millennium Goals, are going to contain a commitment to gender equality under every aspect of the Millennium Goals. Now, that's the most significant thing in terms of world statements of politics that I've heard in my own lifetime. Brenda, I don't know whether you would agree with that. Have you ever known anything as fulsome as that from economic leaders?
No, I haven't, and I think it is extremely positive, and it's a great way forward. And legislation is obviously very, very important, but I'm a real believer that it's not just, what they sign, it's what they do and what they think and how that's executed. I believe that with gender, I believe that with race, I believe that with all forms of equality. So it's brilliant, and I definitely applaud it, but it takes effort and concern on many, many parts.
And yesterday, many people made the point that legislation itself does not change society.
No, it doesn't.
What changes society is cultural attitudes.
Yeah.
And the projection published yesterday was it would take 70 years for gender equality in pay.
Okay, now this is interesting because we pointed out that there were some conflicting pieces of evidence in the papers. So, Sarah, you mentioned this one. This is in The Independent. Poverty forces record number of women into low-paid jobs. At the same time, John, as you had found a piece that said Nicky Morgan basically said that women who have full-time jobs are more or less now at parity of pay now. So how do you square those two stories?
I mean, I think there's a huge gap between what is perceived to be women's work and what's perceived to be men's work. And that's often where the pay gap comes from. Women are doing lower paid jobs because those roles are seen as being less important. Often they're in the domestic sector, retail, catering, and those attract more part-time, 0 hours contracts. So I wouldn't be surprised if those two pieces of evidence are true. It's just what weight you put on them. We all know that women have been far harder hit by the crash in the economy. There's far more women out of work, far more women lost their jobs, far more women are in long-term unemployment than before. So to say that it's better in some sectors is not really seeing the big picture.
Okay, but the big picture seemed to also include the fact that we are being told that more and more women are starting their own businesses.
Yes.
But again, what you uncovered with that is it's not that simple.
No, Fawcett, I think it was, did some digging into this, and there's a lot of women who are categorised as being self-employed, but actually they're earning less than minimum wage. They are really quite poverty-stricken because actually what's happening is employers are forcing women to become contractors and self-employed, so it's essentially a 0 hours contract without calling it a 0 hours contract. So the government can make big claims about how many self-employed women there are, how many women there are starting their own businesses, when the reality is it's just a twist on an old story we've heard before.
Okay, so from that you'd say, well, the good news is that women in full-time jobs seem to be moving towards pay parity.
Yes, that's good news.
But women are unfairly being penalised when austerity hits.
Yeah.
Because actually they often have 2 jobs, 3 jobs, juggling jobs, etc., etc. If we were looking at the papers now in Australia, Robyn, would they be telling a similar story? Would International Women's Day be being celebrated in the way that John suggested it is here?
I had a very quick scan online, being hopeful, but my hopefulness didn't yield anything very much. The Australian Financial Review, which is normally not a bad read, was kicking Julia Gillard again. This is a story that's just not going away, and as you will have all observed, the demise of Australia's first female Prime Minister has led to a current government which has less women in Parliament and some very, very difficult challenges in terms of international policy and refugee policy. So I couldn't find anything very much. That's not to say there's nothing going on. I'm sure that there will be things going on in Australia all day from many of the great women leaders and indeed many of the men in Australia, but it's not being reflected in the media, and that's not really very surprising.
Well, actually, let's just pick up on this idea of women who get into high positions of power in politics, because we had Margaret Thatcher as a Prime Minister, and people ever onwards went, yes, but look what happened when a woman got into power. You know, whatever you thought of Margaret Thatcher's policies, the additional ingredient for everyone was, yes, but she was a woman. And that was both a good and a bad thing, depending on where you stood. But it's meant that, like, you had one. Now, John, you had this, didn't you, today?
I certainly did. Britsky, Ed's top women at war over Pop Awards party. And the story all centres on the fact that Lucy Powell, who is Ed Miliband's chief of staff, wanted to go to the Brit Awards, and the chief whip, Rosie Winterton, wanted to stay in the Commons for a vote. Now, it is the way this story is written that is so staggering. Yorkshire-born Miss Winterton, who has never married and is renowned for her black leather boots, revels in her role in charge of party discipline. She learned her backroom wheeler-dealing skills from her mentor and close friend John Prescott, who gave her her first break in politics as tea girl in his office in 1980. stylish Lancashire-born brunette Miss Powell has had a meteoric rise through the party, etc., etc. Well, if men write about women in politics like that, what hope has anybody? Okay. I mean, what woman would go into politics?
Jude, I might just say that one of the most powerful attacks on Tony Abbott in Australia at the moment is through his chief advisor, who's a woman, Peter Credlin. It's exactly the same sort of approach.
Yeah. Okay, and if you can't see this, but this is a huge picture of Hillary Clinton. Hillary's emails put US security in jeopardy. Robyn, you pulled that out, really, didn't you?
Yeah, just always choose the worst picture you can, shot up, all the wrinkles, anything you can imagine. That's what they do.
Any thought that, I mean, Hillary looks like she's beating everybody in all the polls?
It seems to indicate there they've done a projection that says if she went up against, I think they've listed 5 other candidates, she would be the winner. And so that's a very good reason to put a bad photograph there, isn't it? I mean, it's needed, you know.
John, we had Ian Katz on from Newsnight on Friday morning, saying that, you know, they were able to notice, and Kathleen Moran was saying the same thing yesterday. Everybody was saying really that the hate mail that comes in for news broadcasters is, you know, pretty consistent, pretty substantial. But for women, it is substantially different and worse. Ian Katz was saying that.
Yeah, it's much more abusive and much more sexist. You know, it's sort of it's of a different order.
Of a different order, and violent and deeply personal.
Yeah, and you know, it has involved stalking and all that sort of thing.
So when we did Women in Politics here on Monday, a lot of women were saying that although they wanted to stand, they'd thought of standing for Parliament, they were put off by the fear of the way that they would be attacked. And not just them, but their families as well. And that this was a really difficult thing for that their families didn't want them to stand because of the amount of trolling that they would get. And I was wondering, Brenda, I mean, it appears occasionally on the news, but do you think this is a major problem for women's representation, how they expect to be treated by the media, who then can be amplified by the social media?
I think it is, and I think you've seen it, and I've witnessed it even in our newsroom, of women being stalked and women having abusive. I've had some abusive Twitter trolls myself, and I just know how terrifying and frightening it is, and I'm not standing for public, I'm just trying to do a blinking job. But I think it's reiterated when you see this, what paper did we get this from? I can't even remember what, it's a whole big piece on Silicon Valley, and anywhere that's sort of male-dominated, it's talking about Silicon Valley is the heart of the coolest, most innovative and powerful of US industries, so why are few women entering? And when you see some of the examples of sexism and women going up to give their tout for jobs and being called bitches before they even get to the lantern and being titillated, and some of the examples in here are just, it makes you realise why we kind of put off, but it also reiterates why it's important that we are there and that we do stand up and that we are represented and that we are a force and to be reckoned with, and that we don't tolerate this kind of really bad behaviour, because it's absolutely quite frightening, the sort of things, the level of things that are going on here.
Now I think this is important. Now,
I can't remember what magazine
it's the Observer. It's a pull-out in the Observer. We're giving a big plug to the Observer this morning, aren't we, and the Independent, and why not? Because actually the front page of this huge pull-out is, does Silicon Valley have a problem with women? And then it answers it over and over again by saying yes. But Nicola Horlick raised this morning on Broadcasting House, and the reason why it seems so important is that if that many men are running the tech companies at the sort of start-up level and then continuing into the most powerful level, is there a culture, since we are all saying that it's not politics, it's culture that influences, is there a culture that is allowing sexism and misogyny in these new tech industries? Let's face it, these aren't old men, these are young men.
If you look at Grand Theft Auto, if you look at some of the examples, while you talk, let me try and see if I can find, because some of it was really quite frightening.
So, you know, again, it's a kind of conflict, isn't it? Because this is the cool new territory, tech so cool, STEM so cool, etc. But actually, we're not really calling this stuff out properly.
It says the founder doesn't recall a single woman on the panel of investors judging the startups and audiences on who's mostly male too. The problems are linked, says Caroline Sinard, researcher director of Clayman. What's the other bit? Whether Silicon Valley's sexism is underrepresentation of women is worse than in the tech industry. in the UK or elsewhere, it's hard to argue, says John. I highlighted something and I can't find it now, but it is quite front, and I do think it is about changing the culture, essentially is what it boils down to.
Could I possibly bring it back to British politics and the House of Commons? Because also in the Observer, female candidates on the rise, but why aren't women voting? And I don't know if anybody's seen the extraordinary Michael Cockrell documentaries that appeared inside the House of Commons.
Yes,
an unbelievable revelation of medieval activity, completely dominated by men. But there's a wonderful moment when the MP for Rotherham stands up and says, "I am the 358th woman ever to sit in the House of Commons." Isn't that absolutely unbelievable that the place has been extant for 500 years and there are not even enough women MPs have ever sat in it to fill it? That is an unbelievable state of affairs. And why are women not voting? Well, my suspicion must be that this does not appear to be something with which they feel particularly connected. I worked on the Scottish referendum campaign, which is one of the most electrifying political events I've ever been present at. And that sense of alienation, which was felt there and is felt in all sorts of areas, but I think it must be felt, I don't know, I'm not a woman, but I would suspect that women must feel alienated from Westminster. If you don't see your own people doing the job, why would you want to do it?
But this morning you saw it as well, Justine Green in playing down the whole culture of sexism within politics. I found this quite frightening. When you're someone in that position and you can make a difference and say something, bloody well do.
Well, I think Justine Green gave a fantastic speech here on Friday, and I think she's done amazing work. But confronted with the question about, are the men in your party good feminists? She was really flawed. I mean, she actually said, I've never really given much thought.
Well, I'm the one who actually pressed Cameron on whether he was a feminist, and if you remember, it was a very circuitous route. But after about 3 minutes, we got to, I am a feminist.
Oh yes. Well, it's fingers crossed.
Like Jude said, it's a work in progress.
It's a work in progress. Thousands of people who are coming to this festival, probably it'll be about 35,000 over the whole 3 days. That's not just for fun. I mean, people are coming, you're coming really because you're anxious and interested in how we can make progress. And that's what you expect to use your vote for. So it's a very disturbing idea that women aren't voting. What it's like, again, in Australia, Robyn, are women moved to be part of the political parties?
Well, I think so. I mean, first of all, we have compulsory voting, which I love. I love going to the polls on poll day and you see the community that you live in, that you're voting in. I really love compulsory voting, so it means that all the women in Australia are obliged to vote. And if we think things might be grim on the federal level in Australia, you need to be aware of the recent Queensland election where a wonderful Premier, former Premier, Anna Bligh, 2 elections ago was defeated by an extreme right-wing Premier called Campbell Newman. And after that election, the Labor Party had 9 seats and the Liberal coalition had 70 or 80. I mean, it was more than decimated. And in the election just a couple of months ago, Anastasia Palaszczuk won the election and suddenly went from 9 seats in Labor to 44. And so there is now a hung parliament, but there's a female premier who has taken on the arts portfolio as her only portfolio, and a deputy premier who is also a female, and half the parliament, half the members are now women, many of whom never expected to govern, so we'll see what happens. But in the dark, there's also some great light, and clearly from that example in Queensland, many, many women are willing to stand and wanting to stand and getting elected. So that's a great cause for hopefulness at the moment.
And John, thank you. John, you're travelling the world all the time. You're seeing what it's like from different parts of the planet. We have the horror of ISIS and the idea that Boko Haram are just joining up with ISIS at the moment. On the other hand, you have, as Robyn says, great moments when female equality suddenly seems to have a clear path and can get running. What's your sense of, should we be feeling that processes are on the move for the better across the world?
Yes, possibly, if you spend a lot of time in Scandinavia. And, Denmark, female prime minister, a lot of women MPs. Norway, I'm not sure what the situation now is, but certainly in the last few years, has had a majority of women in the cabinet. But I would say it's not yet quite the time to go, hip hip hooray.
Okay. I think that's a no.
Well, it's a bit of a bore, really, because the president of Argentina has been a bit of a letdown, hasn't she?
Well, of course, this is the problem. Every woman gets auditioned personally, don't they, over and over again. Like, we've had a woman, she wasn't good enough, she's a bit corrupt. That's a woman for you. So, yes, it is a letdown, and it's also a terrible pressure.
It's a problem of expectation as well, because when you are the one, everyone imposes their expectations on you, don't they? And that's the difficulty.
If Jake's around, if someone can just give me a thumbs up or a thumbs down to say, well, it's not going to work here for the next... It's not going to work. OK, fine, I'll stop worrying about it, but thank you anyway.
But they should get a woman on the job.
No. Actually, there I am going to intervene. The guys have been absolutely effing amazing, haven't they? They have. For those who've been here over the 5 days, they have run ragged as I've just shoved more and more material in front of them and said, you couldn't just do this for me, could you? I mean, I actually think they could put Sarah Brightman into space, our team.
Go do it. 35 mil on the table.
OK, let's turn to something that is both good... Well, it is definitely good news. It's just interesting the way it's put. So there's a headline here... Well, it's a little sideline, actually, called Rape Classes for 11-year-olds. Now, just think about that for a minute, that actual phrase, rape classes for 11-year-olds. So I think, Robyn, you were the one that picked this up.
I saw this at breakfast this morning. The Sunday Times was the only paper that was available in my hotel, and I read rape classes for 11-year-olds. What on earth is going on? Of course, the article underneath is actually quite good. It's about fighting for consent classes, but it does reveal the role of the sub-editor, who will actually pervert the title in any way they want, calling them rape classes. In fact, it's quite a good little article about pushing for consent classes in schools, but when you look at it, you're horrified.
Because it makes you think they're going to be taught how to rape.
Exactly, yeah. Which is sort of what people have been suggesting over the last 2 days that a lot of the gaming is doing. It is actually lessons in abuse and rape and violence, etc.
It concerned me. I've took this one really personally because I have a daughter now who's 10, and I'm thinking, it's a really good thing that they're discussing this. But I'm thinking, and I had her in the car, and I said, "Well, what do you think of it?" And her immediate response was to do that. It's like she wants to be a kid. She wants to do Minecraft. She wants to play with her friends and do girly things and play with football. She did football last week and was really excited about that. But to think at this age now, I have to have this pressure of educating her about how to deal with men, how to control her body, how to control her mind, how to learn to say no when and she's engaging with boys all the time. And it's a good thing because it's a reality, but it really frightens me. And when we were just going out the door when I saw the news headlines, it didn't make the papers about Boko Haram now, joining the consent with ISIS. I'm thinking, these poor Nigerian girls, these 3 girls that have gone to Syria, what is happening to our girls? What is happening to our world? And what do we do about it? It left me terrified and really, really sad. But the reality is, I guess, we have to educate them. We have to take control, and we have to teach them very early to take control. Because when gangs are using the girlfriends of other gangs as power, when our girls are being used as important as getting power, it terrifies me, and I just want to put cotton wool on my little girl, and I can't.
Yes. Yesterday we had the campaigner for the Yazidi women who are being taken away and raped at 11 and 12 systematically. We had the woman who's leading the campaign to bring back the Nigerian schoolgirls. So the thing is, although we would like to cover our ears up when we're 11, those girls can't cover their ears up at all. And the issue, I think, is can we get the world to be in uproar and outrage about the way that girls and women are treated? Or is it just... it's always like that, it's always going to be like that, business as usual? John, I hate to use you as the man here, but do you think men are beginning to be outraged?
I think if you take, for example, Boko Haram, the world is in uproar and outrage about them, but unfortunately Nigeria doesn't seem to be. Now that's a rather serious state of affairs. There's a very sophisticated, developed country in many ways. It has a Sandhurst-trained officer class, etc., 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 and yet it appears to have had no impact whatever, and actually not really very much interest in recovering the 300 girls. And that's what I find really alarming. It's a chaotic country as well as being a very rich country and a very poor country. There are many confusions and many contradictions in Nigeria, but I think it's a terrible shame on that country that they've not been able to do anything at all about finding these girls and bringing them back. And, you know, the president, good luck Jonathan, literally just never mentions it. It's just not an issue. And yet for us outside, it is an issue. And for the poor parents and families and the rest of it, it's utter grief.
I wonder whether there's a relationship between a general... I mean, we're all concerned, as you say, you know, we're all talking about it because we are concerned about those things here. But you drew our attention this morning, I think you and Robyn both, to the sports pages. And let's face it, a lot of people throw the papers away and just pick up the sports pages. Or they leaf through the papers and then they get to the sports pages and then they really get stuck in. And both of these papers, this Observer and the Sunday Times, and these are the broadsheets, had very, very few representations of women at all. John, do you want to... I'll stay with you for a minute. I think it was...
Well, you had to get to the last 2 pages, and there you could find a woman horse trainer who's highlighted with her husband, I have to say, for training a sort of unlikely horse. And then, well, she's the third to back. But this is an 18-page, 16-page Sunday Times sports page, and then there is one other reference equally on the back end of the paper. World title is the icing on the cake for Yarnold, and this is about skating. So, you know, that's all there is. Everything else is male sport. And even the dear old Observer only gets to that skating. That's the only reference on the back page of the Observer. So sport is not a women's deal at all.
And when we talked to a number of men during the Men's Festival, but being a man, about what are the things that they really, really think are kind of critical and essential and finally to be proud of, they talked about physical prowess as probably being the most important thing that sort of distinguishes a real man. I mean, they all said that, even the ones who didn't particularly pride themselves on physical prowessness. So it's interesting that you still have a feeling that men don't believe that women can do sport. Not all men, obviously, but that women are not part of that sort of idea of, you know, what makes a really powerful person.
When, as part of the campaign, some people did a video experiment for us where we had 6 months' worth of The Sun, and pictures were cut out of every man and every woman and put on to 2 sides of a wall. Go on YouTube and find it. It's amazing. It's really powerful. And there were no sportswomen. In 6 months' worth of the paper, there were no sportswomen. And the Sun prides itself on being heavy on its sports coverage and big on its sports coverage. And we talk a lot to people during the campaign about you can't be what you can't see. And young women just aren't, they're not seeing a diversity of role models. You know, I adore Nicola Adams. I think she's amazing. You know, I'd have her on the front of every sports paper forever. But is that a thing? Can we do that?
Start campaign.
Yeah. Okay, that's my next campaign. But there is the new video showing girls, you know, sweating and I look like a girls pig. And I think things like that are really important because they do tell women that, you know, it's all right. We can be this. And actually, there are really amazing women in the world of sport that just are completely ignored. Andy Murray gets a female coach and the world goes, oh my God, what's he thinking? Has he lost his mind? And it's really, you know, we've looked at loads of papers today. There's just nothing on women's sport.
And I didn't know, we were talking about this the other day, and the Girls Can campaign is really, really affecting girls. It's very, very good. But I didn't realise that Andy Murray had actually specifically gone out to make sure he did get a woman and made a point of saying that, which I applaud him for. I think that's terrific. But obviously then it's under terrible scrutiny. I wouldn't like to be her trying to, you know, well...
It all gets blamed on her when
everything,
his play goes down.
Yes, when his play goes down, it's blamed on him, as opposed to being blamed on being Scottish, which I know that some people blame him for.
Until he wins.
Not me, I should say. Okay, here's a very different one altogether, which just taking us to a different part of the world. African leading ladies. So I thought, this is in the Telegraph, I thought that was going to be about some of the amazing activists and politicians. It isn't exactly that, but it is in a way. It's female safari guides are shaking up a male-dominated profession across the African continent. And I just thought, that's an exciting article. And the quote from one of the women is, this job is 90% about the people and 10% about the wildlife. And it's a bit like the sort of tech argument, really. They're basically saying that there's no reason why women wouldn't be able to be great safari leaders. And although initially it was all about, well, what do you know about,
Big tigers.
Tigers and guns. Yes, tigers and guns. And I'm sure there's a lot to know about tigers and guns. I know a lot about tigers. But actually they were saying, no, the main thing you need to know is how to look after people, how to keep people safe, how to nurture people, etc., etc. So these wonderful women are now becoming great tour guides. And so I just think that's a great article if you get a chance to read it. And they're all lined up. And they're all lined up in their safari outfits, and they haven't been made to wear bikinis.
Not bikinis, leopard print bikinis.
No. Now here's a different one altogether, on a lighter note. Is it a lighter note? Sandra Bullock and Jennifer Lawrence star in biopics of groundbreaking businesswomen. I think this was yours, Sarah. Do you want to...
Yeah, I mean, firstly, it's news that 2 women are making films about women, which is... Yeah, I know. And it gets like half a page. It's ridiculous. But they're both making films about women business leaders. So Jennifer Lawrence is making a film about a lady called, I've forgotten her first name, Joy, who invented super mops.
Yeah.
And Sandra Bullock is making a film about the lady who marketed Tupperware. So she didn't invent Tupperware, but she launched the idea of Tupperware parties, and she got sort of housewives into it and made an awful lot of money for the company, and then actually was quite sadly fired, and it ended quite badly for her. But it's just really interesting that suddenly women making films about women has become news. And there was a lot, in the Oscars about how few of the Best Picture nominees were about women, about when you looked at the Best Actress nominees, very few of them were in Best Pictures. So, it's funny that it's news, it's ridiculous that it's news, but actually it's quite nice to see some of these leading lights in Hollywood kind of embracing this. And I know Reese Witherspoon set up her own company because there weren't enough roles for women as they moved into their sort of late 30s and 40s. Yeah. So she said, well, I'm going to make them.
Well, I think that's a really interesting reflection on the way the film industry has changed too, because historically Marilyn Monroe and Judy Garland both tried to set up companies so that they could try to control the roles that they played. Mm-hmm. And Marilyn Monroe in particular was completely laughed out of town. She didn't want to play those passive roles all the time. Yeah. And she didn't want to always sing in that tiny little wispy voice. She actually could sing, and she had a voice, formed her own company, and everybody said, well, you're just a greedy bitch who shouldn't be doing that sort of stuff. It's very interesting to see how Reese Witherspoon can do the same 50 years later and succeed at it. That's a very good sign.
I think they can because they're in positions, because they have the money. Because at the Women in Creative Industries this week, there was the woman who works here in Britain in film, and she was saying it was really difficult for women to make films that were, reflecting women's voices and reflecting women's experiences. So it's still a challenge, unless, like Reese or these leading ladies, you have the money, you can just go and do it yourself.
Actually, Lucille Ball had a huge production company and was, this is the other thing, of course, that although it's been difficult for women in the past, women have broken through, but then people revise the history of them and don't realise that they have been the role model and the trailblazer. I think what's interesting about this, it covers so many areas that we've talked about. So the sub-editor has put this title, it's Tupperware versus Mops in the film clash of the domestic titans. Now, as a woman growing up in the 60s, 70s, I kind of thought Tupperware was ridiculous. I now use it all the time. And, why would I have been interested in mops? But I've just been...
You only think it's Tupperware. It may well not be.
Sorry?
Yes,
no, of course.
Tupperware has become a thing to describe a plastic container.
You're quite right, John. You're quite right, and I know that you are an expert. I know a lot about tigers, you know a lot about Tupperware and the extension of the brand. But what I was going to say was that James Dyson and the Hoover nobody sort of giggles that he invented the Hoover. But here's a woman who invented, I'm just going to read you this, it is very important, right? She invented the self-wringing mop and a space-saving clothes hanger. Her name was Brownie Wise. And, that sounds like a really interesting scientific, practical invention. And basically what Jennifer Lawrence is saying is that nobody's ever heard of her. But we've all heard of James Dyson.
I've never heard of her self-wringing mop. I must get one.
We're going to buy you one at the end of this, actually. And then similarly, I mean, the Tupperware story, obviously, is about marketing, isn't it? It's a fantastic marketing person. Discovered how to sell to women in these Tupperware parties and make sure that, that they were given demonstrations to come to their home, etc., etc. And because we have been encouraged to think that domesticity is sort of necessary but silly in some way, when actually it is necessary and essential and not silly. Again, they're not heroines. They're deemed to be sort of just of the domestic.
It's a waste of time for the busy.
It's a waste of time for the busy. Yes, that's right.
I think too, it's true that Tupperware is another way of earning money for many women who have kids and need to work from home, and it's a genuine way of income. I think, Jude, too, the domesticity thing has affected many women in many professions for a long time. I wrote a play a few years ago called Architektin, which was about Vienna's first female architect, Margareta Schüttler-Hotzky, and she invented the first ergonomic kitchen, and basically said there were so many men lost in World War I that the women would have to support the families and work at the same time. And as an architect, what could she possibly do to help them? Well, she could make work in the home easier. But from then on, and she lived to be 103, including surviving a concentration camp during World War II, she was boxed into the role of making kitchens and kindergartens and never got to fulfil her role as an architect. And that's the same reason about devaluing things to do with domestic life, which has been largely a woman's role.
Okay, now we're going to end on something which, again, just shows sort of schizophrenia generally, I think, which is this one. I think several of you picked this one out. It says, Bobs reveal dark roots of UK recovery. Now, I don't know if you could see what do you think that's about? I wonder if you all know what that's about. It's about haircuts. Right, so it's 5 women, some of them with short hair and some with long hair, demonstrating that UK recovery is best understood by whether women are cutting their hair and having their roots done.
It's an absolutely staggering piece. I mean, it's as if they knew we were going to discuss the papers today. Because, I mean, I'm afraid I've had to do a survey of our own panel. Now, I think we begin with sort of yet to feel the full flow of recovery.
Obviously.
She's getting a bit of it and has reduced those long flowing bits down there. Jude's sort of on the way, but really the only two who are really feeling the full burn-up of this wonderful economic recovery, the full boom, is Robyn and me with the shortest hair that you can possibly get. I mean, what crap.
Okay, well, I think on that joyful moment, what crap?